the 8th Annual Workplace Conference, especially to those of you who are here for the first time. My name is Drew Mason, and I'm President of the Alberta Congress Board for this year, and in my day job, the Assistant Deputy Minister with the Alberta Ministry of International, Intergovernmental, and Aboriginal Relations. It's my pleasure to be here with you tonight. The Alberta Congress Board has brought together people from diverse sectors and backgrounds for more than 30 years now, with a goal to address common issues and concerns. It's a unique opportunity for business, labor, government, and related sectors to collaborate in order to better understand diverse perspectives on common workplace matters. We believe that through the conference, we can address some of the challenges that are facing Alberta now and some of the challenges that Alberta will face in the future. One of the key assets of this conference is that we look to anticipate future trends and their impact on our province and on our organizations years in advance. For example, for the past several years, we've discussed and looked at the potential effects of a skills shortage, a heated economy, and the major demographic shift of an aging workforce, and that's something that's only really the beginning of a major trend. Many of you in this room can appreciate the necessity of finding solutions to address these types of issues, and it's your participation at this conference that makes that possible. We look to you for insight into what the future is likely to hold for Alberta in many of these sectors, and from this a picture begins to form and you can gauge your own organization's position as what it has to do to prepare for these emerging trends. And of course the Workplace Conference is also a forum that provides an excellent opportunity to network and build networks beyond and outside your own sector. As leaders and decision makers, you can learn from each other about what is happening, and especially from a point of view that you might not have previously considered. You can develop a deeper understanding of the importance of working together in a collaborative manner to address the issues that affect all of us, to make things better and help shape the future of our economy and our society overall. At this time, we want to provide you with a bit of an overview of the conference. Unfortunately, Dr. Mike Percy, this year's conference chair, was unavoidably delayed today. He will be with us here tomorrow to share his perspectives later on in the conference. So now I'd like to ask Don Diduck, Director with the Congress Board, to come up and provide the overview. So please help me in welcoming Don.
Thank you very much, Drew. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. This year's conference theme is 2020, Alberta Transformed. While the broad theme of our conference is about the convergence of environment and industry and its growing impact on our workforce and workplaces, it is inclusive of other major issues, such as the royalty review. And permit me to expand a little bit on this point. On the surface, we can agree, generally, that the royalty review is about the question of ownership of Alberta's energy resources. How do we responsibly manage these resources from a fiscal point of view on behalf of Albertans, but also at the same time balance this with the environmental and the economic realities of industrial development? A related question is, how do we sustain growth and manage it so that we have the same level of satisfaction that we are doing the very best that we possibly can with the challenges and opportunities before us? 2020, Alberta Transformed, was selected as our theme this year by the Alberta Congress Board in recognition that key decisions are being made now and in the near future, and that these will have profound implications. As delegates, you have the opportunity to discuss these issues within the context of our workplaces and as leaders and decision makers of our respective sectors. Today we are witnessing a major shift taking place with environmental priorities being defined by regulation and expressed more deeply by the changing behavior of consumers, business, and government. These changes are forcing the convergence that started with unconscious thinking about the environment to frontline consciousness in terms of our policies, business practices, and the expectations we have for our workforce. There is no going back, and folks, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just different, and a different way of looking at things. Environment and environmental sustainability is now as important as our current focus on developing a highly skilled workforce. In other words, the integration of environment and industry are front and center in the transformation of Alberta's economy to what many of us now refer to as a green economy. it will have a growing impact on our workplaces. When the Conference Steering Committee came together over the past year, they developed a conference program that encompasses various perspectives on the issue of environment industry, touching on such things as energy, employment, and sustainability. Many of the ideas and perspectives you will hear from our speakers and panelists will provide information you may want to consider as we together try to answer and find solutions to what we believe are the top issues. If you've had a chance to look in the program booklet, you'll have noticed 3 sub-themes that have been identified by the Conference Steering Committee. First sub-theme poses the question, what are today's realities? Second one is, and related to that is, do you believe them to be relevant? What are those issues that are relevant? Second sub-theme is, how do we transform? And in other words, what do we need to do in order to adjust to the new realities? And some of these realities are really, really engaging. Canadian dollar was 89 cents a year ago. Now it's $1.04 today. Barrel of oil was about $60. Now it's hovering a lot more than that. And these are things that are coming upon us very quickly. Third sub-theme is sustainable growth. What are the best strategies? And the key aspect of this sub-theme is asking yourselves, what steps do we need to take now? And as a delegate, you're asked to learn more about these issues and also to share your perspectives with others. There is enough information, enough knowledge, and enough influence in this room to bring about cooperation and collaborative change to our workplaces. And that is the sum of this effort that will lead to better workplaces in Alberta. We ask you to embrace the cooperative and collaborative process that we utilize at this conference, to take the time to understand and appreciate where the other person is coming from on these issues, and to find common ground. We're taking constructive action, moving forward, and building on relationships that transcend the boundaries of our sectors, organizations, and our communities. I challenge you this weekend to open your minds to new possibilities, new friendships, and new ways to do things better for yourselves and for your organizations. And before we call upon our keynote speaker, I would like to first acknowledge some people who have contributed their time and effort, both at the board level and steering committee, to put this conference together. And I'm going to introduce some of the members of the board who are here, and I'd ask you to hold your applause. But would you please stand as I call your name? You've already met Drew Mason. Drew, please. Randy DeGay with us, I believe he's on his way here, he'll be here shortly. Ryan Bickley with the Alberta Apprenticeship Board. Gus Brzezicki with Bosco Homes. Tim Bancroft, formerly with Shell Canada. Pat Dalton with the Alberta Teachers Association. Michael Dyer with State Polytechnic. Tom Hesse with the United Food and Commercial Workers Local 401. Tim Brower, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Local 424. Ellen Hambrook, Alberta Employment Immigration Industry. Janine Halbezma, Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Dan McLennan, retired with Bantrell Constructors. Kelvin Matthewick from Service Canada. And one of our board members who cannot be with us here this weekend, Brian McCready from Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. Let's give these folks a big round of applause. I also want to acknowledge those on our steering committee and marketing partnership committee. Those who are present here this evening, please stand as I call your name. I'm going to acknowledge everybody whether they're here or not. Jerry Donnelly, Alberta Building Trades Council. Mick Farrell, Alberta Employment and Immigration Industry. Leonard Gauthier, Alberta Energy. Jack Hubler, Plumbers and Pipefitters, Local Union 488. Paulette Killam, Alberta Seniors and Community Service Supports. David Mattis, Natural Gas Employees Association. Iris Sanders, Tamina Seller from Employabilities. Martin Sodden, Coaching Works. And those on the steering committee who could not be here, Janet Riopel from the City of Edmonton, Christine Couture from Alberta Employment, Immigration and Industry, and Bill Sutherland, Strathcona County, along with Loch Willie from Encana. Please give those folks a round of applause. Thanks for all your hard work. On behalf of the Alberta Congress Board and all delegates attending this year's conference, it would not be possible to undertake this event without our partners. You probably noticed some of the banners in this room as you walked in. We'll be acknowledging our partners throughout the conference, but please permit me to briefly introduce them to you today. Alberta Employment and Immigration Industry, Alberta Building Trades Council, Alberta International Intergovernmental and Aboriginal Affairs, OTNOW Employment and Training Society, Alberta Federation of Labour, These organizations have made it possible to offer a strong program for the benefit of all of us who are in attendance here today, and for those who will benefit by the work we'll do together after this conference concludes. Let's give those folks a big round of applause. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, Preston Manning. Mr. Manning served as a member of the Canadian Parliament from 1993 to 2001, and he founded two political parties, the Reform Party of Canada and the Canadian Reform Conservative Alliance, both of which became the official opposition to the Canadian Parliament. Mr. Manning served as the leader of the opposition from 1997 to 2000 and was also his party's critic for science and technology. Since retirement from Parliament in 2002, Mr. Manning has released a book entitled Think Big, published by McClellan and Stewart, describing his use of the tools and institutions of democracy to change Canada's national agenda. He has also served as a senior fellow of the Canada West Foundation and is a distinguished visitor at the University of Calgary and University of Toronto. Mr. Manning is currently president and CEO of the Manning Centre for Building Democracy and a senior fellow of the Fraser Institute. The Manning Centre is a national not-for-profit organization supporting research, educational, and communications initiatives designed to achieve a more democratic society in Canada guided by conservative principles. Mr. Manning continues to write, speak, and teach on a variety of subjects, including the revitalization of democracy in the Western world, the revitalization of Canadian conservatism, Canada-US relations, strengthening relations between the scientific and political communities, the rebalancing Canadian federalism, the regulation of the genetic revolution, and the management of the interface between faith and politics. A very busy fellow. So please help me welcome Mr. Preston Manning.
Well, thank you very much, Don, and Drury, thank you for the invitation to join you and for the opportunity to speak. I always like coming to Jasper and to Jasper Park Lodge. I mean, I think you're all conscious. This is quite a historical place. There's been meetings that have affected this province, even this country, held in this place. In this room, I think it was this room, way back in the 60s, there was a First Minister's, a Premier's Conference where the Premiers actually agreed for a brief period on how to amend the Constitution. And my father was Premier, and Mike Pearson was the Prime Minister, and my father was so excited that they actually agreed on something that he gave a call to Pearson from a phone in the lobby here saying that they agreed on. It's called the Fulton-Favreau formula for amending the Constitution. You agree on that, you bring the Constitution out. So he called Pearson and told him the guys have agreed, you know, and, but he said I wouldn't quite count on it until Premier Lesage gets back to Quebec. And sure enough, Premier Lesage gets back to Quebec, called Pearson and said, I did agree at that conference, but my people don't want me to go along with it. So it blew apart. But that meeting, that historic meeting, held, I think it would have been right in this room. And we were talking a little bit at the table here about the oil sands. Back in the early 60s, J. Howard Pugh was the driving force behind the Great Canadians plant, the first commercial plant, set up shop at the Point Cabin here at the Jasper Park Lodge. In the summer, this is where he'd come, and he'd hold his engineers and people that come back and forth between here and Fort McMurray. So this place has played a historic role. My own little recollections here, I ran against Joe Clark in the 1988 federal election, this Yellowhead riding, which stretches from almost from Edmonton to the BC border. I had a great fight with Joe here. The one time I impersonated Joe was I was knocking on the door in the town just north of here, fairly late at night, and I made the mistake. A guy opened the door and his puppy came out. I stepped on the foot of this puppy, and it started to squeal like a pig, and the door started opening down the block, and this was in Swan Hills actually, where the dog was much more highly valued than a politician. So what do you do to recover? The guy grabbed the dog and ran inside, and his wife came out, just standing there. And so I did the only thing you could do. I said, my name's Joe Clark. So I have great memories of Jasper. And I hope you do too. I think it's a very appropriate place to begin your deliberations on 2020 and Alberta Transformed. Now, Don mentioned the three questions that, and they were given to me too, that you're going to deliberate on. And the first one was, what are today's realities? And the second one then, how are we going to transform to meet those realities? And the third one was, what strategies might be used to sustain growth in the province? So let me start with the first one and quickly go through the other two. What are today's realities? Well, one that comes to mind is the economic reality, that Alberta's taken basically a market-based approach to economic development, with government playing an enabling and a facilitating role by favorable investment and taxation conditions. And this approach has delivered tremendous growth over the last decade, particularly in the energy sector. It's given us high incomes and a large number of jobs and a high standard of living. And of course, it's been further stimulated by North America and the world's insatiable appetite for energy and the high energy prices. Of course, this growth in the energy sector is not without uncertainties. While you've got high demand and high prices pressing on the accelerator, you've got a growing number of forces tromping on the brake. The Federal Finance Department's decision to curtail income and royalty trusts, the growing pressures to internalize environmental costs, the upward rise of the dollar, the decline in natural gas prices, to name only a few, and now adding to those potential pressures on the brake, the current royalty revision, which maybe in the question period someone would like to ask about that, because we could probably talk about that all night. But the one point I want to make is one of the big economic realities of Alberta is that it is essentially a market-driven economy led by the energy sector, with government playing a facilitating role. And so far, this has resulted in a pretty strong economic performance. But now here's another reality, and I think it's the one that your conference organizers wanted us to focus on. As Alberta's economic growth continues to rocket upwards, the actual and potential impact upon our environment is growing more and more, and much of that is negative. The accelerated development of the Athabasca oil sands puts enormous pressures on regional water supply, and of course it makes a huge contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Coal bed methane development, unless carefully managed and limited, could have irrevocable effects on the landscapes and watersheds and ecodiversity, particularly the eastern slopes. Accelerated economic development combined with potential climate changes threatens us with both severe water shortages and damages to Alberta's boreal forests. So while we live in a market-driven, energy-dominated province, we also live in a province where environmental issues are becoming huge, and where large numbers of our people, especially the young, place a tremendous value on our magnificent physical environment. You know from our history, a lot of people came to Alberta to get land, which is land isn't just an economic thing. Land is an emotional thing, and land is connected to the ecosystem. When you ask Albertans today about their top-of-mind priority political concerns, right up there at the top, higher now than healthcare, which for years has been the top-of-mind issue, is environmental concerns. And it is the #1 concern of the next generation. When you ask the younger people what their #1 concern is, environmental concerns are right at the top. And in fact, more than 80% of Albertans place the environment as a top priority for our children's future. So another reality, the second reality, I think this is the one you want us to focus on a bit, which we cannot deny, is the increasingly high priority which Albertans give to environmental protection and conservation. So that leads me then to a political reality, and that is to suggest to you that the political reality that these two other realities create is a challenge to Alberta's business and labor and political leadership. And that challenge is to marry a genuine commitment to environmental conservation with our market-driven approach to economic development. Can that be done? I suggest that's one of the key questions that faces this province politically, because there's environmental effects, there's economic effects, and people like yourselves, business, labor, and government, are in an ideal position to address that question, to give an answer to people of this province. There are people who say that can't be done, that you can't marry a genuine commitment to conservation and economic development at the same time. People say that private corporations and free markets producing goods and services are the sources of environmental stress and not part of the problem. But if that is in fact the case, I want to challenge that assumption, then the alternative solution usually put forward is greatly increased government intervention in the economy in the name of environmental conservation. If you don't think markets can solve conservation problems, then the only alternative is for the government to get in with both feet and try to solve them. But before going down that road, we want to examine the wisdom of that option. Because planned economies, heavily dominated by governments, as in the case of China today, have atrocious environmental track records, which surely no one wants to emulate. And I suggest that if genuine conservation can't be married to a market-based approach to economic development, then invariably you're going to get polarized on this issue, with environmentalists on one end, people trying to conserve the environment on the one end, with business and economic development people on the people that are worried about jobs and incomes on the other end. And you get this issue polarized into two warring camps, a little bit like what's happened on the healthcare issue. And the media will have a field day, because the media actually likes polarized political debates a lot more than they do cooperative ones, because there's conflict and controversy. And I suggest that if Alberta ever gets polarized into those two camps, that both the environment and economic development will suffer. So before going down that road, let me present some reasons for believing that a marriage of genuine commitment to conservation and market-driven economic development is possible. That there are grounds for believing that a market-driven economy can transform itself into one that is environmentally committed and environmentally responsible. Just a few things. First of all, both conservationists and conservatives not in the political sense, but in the small c market-driven sense, believe in living within their means. I was in a little debate with David Suzuki a while back, in which he asked the question, well, how could you be a conservative in that economic sense and believe in free enterprise and free markets, and a genuine conservationist at the same time? And I said, well, David, the two words, even conservation and conservative, come from the same root. At least conceptually, they should be compatible. And more importantly, if one of the principles which economic conservatives profess to believe in is living within our means, I mean, that's the principle behind budget balancing. That's what budget balancing is about, living within our means. And if one believes in that concept, can it not be extended to the environment? Can you not talk about living within our means ecologically? You know, that concept can be extended in the environmental thing where it's compatible. Secondly, an encouraging thing is that there's a growing body of research and experience which integrates conservation values with market mechanisms on which we in the public can draw. The economists tell us, pure economists tell us, that market-based systems, a market is simply a system that brings supply to bear on demand using pricing signals and incentives. And a pure market doesn't care what the demand is. If the demand is for widgets or for cars or for wheat or for oil or whatever, it'll bring supply to bear on that demand using pricing signals and financial incentives. If the demand is for clean air and clean water and reclaimed land, that same mechanism can bring supply to bear on that demand using pricing signals and financial incentives. So, and there are more and more researchers who are trying to explore how does that exactly work. I think of Elizabeth Brubaker at the Toronto-based environmental probe or energy probe. She's conducted case studies that champion using private property rights to try to solve problems in the fishery, particularly declining species. Here in Alberta, people like Barry Warbitz and the gang at the Canada West Foundation have been doing some useful work under the heading of natural capital. That while business focuses on financial capital and social capital, human capital, there's also such a thing as natural capital, environmental capital. We have to preserve, we've got to live off the interest, we can't live off the capital or we'll get ourselves into trouble, just as we do in the business world. And outfits like the Nature Conservancy of Canada, which is making huge investments here in Alberta, uses basically a private sector technique of restrictive covenant placed on private land voluntarily by the owner or paying the owner to do it in order to preserve that land for certain purposes. So there is research being done on how to use market mechanisms to achieve conservation. We just have to do more of it. And then thirdly, while the theory of how to marry conservation marketplace approaches is imperfectly developed, there are in our own province people who have got these two concepts integrated in their own heads. And the people I find around Alberta that have done that are ranchers. Like in one respect, if you send a political scientist out to analyze ranchers, they say they're the most rock-ribbed fiscal conservatives there are. The ranching industry resisted government intervention in that sector more than any other part of the agricultural community. So what are they? On one hand, they're fiscal conservatives, market-driven, market-oriented, etc. But at the same time, some of those ranchers, particularly in the southwest corner of this province, are almost fanatically committed to preserving the fescue and the watersheds of the eastern slope. Now, what are those people? Are they green conservatives or blue environmentalists, or like they're some kind of a hybrid? And not many of them can give you the theory on which they're operating, but they have integrated those two values within their own personalities and within their own operations. And I think that's something that's encouraging, that we actually need more of it. So my point is then that there are ways and means of integrating conservation and a commitment to market-based mechanisms. And I want to encourage you to explore ways and means of doing that, not just at 90,000 feet, which is kind of where I come in from, but in the practical areas where you as business and labor and government people have to work on a day-to-day basis. Now, the next thing I'd like to do is look at some strategies for achieving sustainable growth that is both green and profitable, that has these two dimensions to it: conservation, our environment, but a strong market-driven approach to economic growth. What are the strategies? What are some of the techniques that can help us along? I just want to list these, make a few comments about them. Many of you are more experienced in how these things might actually work, but hopefully the list at least will be helpful to you. The first strategy I'd like to mention is full cost accounting and pricing. Someone has said that if it's important, measure it. And what full cost accounting and pricing says, that if environmental consequences of producing a good and service are important, then the cost of those impacts and actions to mitigate or eliminate them should be measured and internalized into the price of the good or service being produced. Where these costs are internalized via taxation, the revenues generated by them should not be treated by governments as just another revenue source, but held in trust and invested in incentives and abatement measures which accomplish the conservation method for which they were collected. In this province, and I'd be interested in actually your advice on this or your judgment on this, perhaps one of the best places to start applying the concept of full cost accounting and pricing is with respect to water. As you know, our province includes some of the most important and valuable aquifers on the continent and watersheds, but we're also tremendous consumers of water. As individuals, most of us consider water free, or virtually free, so there's virtually no price constraint on our use of that resource. We, of course, consume enormous amounts of water for agricultural purposes, particularly irrigation in the south. And besides the large amounts of water used for production and enhanced recovery by the conventional petroleum industry, there is the additional 3 to 6 barrels of water required for every barrel of synthetic crude produced from oil sands. These demands mean that Alberta withdraws more water per capita for industrial purposes than any other province in Canada, by far, our per capita use. And Canada itself is second in per capita consumption of water in the OECD. There is absolutely no substitute for communicating those messages. There's no substitute for a properly established pricing system. So the question that this leads me to, for those that would lead Alberta in the years ahead, are you in favor of a public policy which would require Albertans to meter, measure, price, and pay for all water used in this province? That's one to contemplate, okay? A second thing is incentives. I don't know about you, but if you're trying to get me to do something better or different, I'm much more likely to respond positively and enthusiastically if you offer me incentives rather than if you threaten me with penalties. And of course, governments use subsidies and taxes as incentives and disincentives to influence all kinds of economic behavior. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it would be the advantage of every province in this country and the federal government to do an audit of our current taxation and subsidy regimes to determine what incentives or disincentives they provide to environmentally responsible economic activity and to redirect them accordingly. You know, Alberta in the early days found it necessary to carve out a portion of the provincial energy market for synthetic oil. When J. Howard Pugh wanted to go ahead with the Great Canadian Oil Sands project, his main discussion with the Alberta government was not over royalty and taxes. In those days, and some of the old timers here remember this, Alberta couldn't sell its conventional crude. And so if you were going to start producing synthetic crude, you had to guarantee a chunk of the market for that crude, or you couldn't finance the plant. And so Alberta did choose to set aside 5% of the market in those days for synthetic crude. And you wonder if there isn't some application of that principle today, of offering incentives to develop renewable energy sources to ensure that Alberta will be the energy province of the future. And perhaps having to guarantee a portion of the market at the early stage in order to ensure those kinds of development. So my second set of questions for you are for those that would lead our province in the future in both business, labor, and government. Would you be in favor, would you press for an audit of Alberta's current taxation and subsidy regimes to see what incentives and what disincentives does it provide for marrying environmental conservation and our economic development? What specific incentives would you encourage or offer to encourage entrepreneurship and innovation in this area? A third strategy or device is one system, ecosystem-based regulation. If you examine the environmental policy statements of the federal government and the provincial governments across the country, you find, of course, innumerable references to regulation in the name of environmental conservation. Regulation is the great tool that we use. What you don't find is clear recognition of the fact that our ecosystems, river systems, watersheds, airsheds, and so forth, do not respect political boundaries. They don't respect provincial, federal, municipal, international boundaries, and that often split jurisdiction over the environment ends up leading to duplication and an inability to hold anybody accountable for the results, because somebody can always blame somebody else. When we speak, therefore, of regulating, say, in the name of conservation, some aspect of the Saskatchewan river system, whether it's water quality or water volumes or fish populations or whatever, what we have now is a multiplicity of overlapping authorities and regulations involving the federal government, the provincial government, and some municipal governments, with the result that both the efficiency of regulation and the accountability for results is greatly reduced. Is there an alternative? Well, in theory there is, and whether it can be put into practice is something maybe you people could shed some light on. The alternative would be the establishment of a single regulatory authority, the Saskatchewan River Watershed Authority or whatever, to which the federal government, the provincial government, and the municipal governments would delegate their authority in order to provide one window ecosystem-based regulation. A start towards such a regime could be made by Alberta taking the initiative and negotiating a memorandum of understanding with other governments in relation to the regulation of that river basin. Similar to the agreement we recently negotiated with British Columbia to facilitate greater free flows of trade. So another question that I leave with those that would lead us in the future, do you see merit in one window ecosystem-based regulation, particularly for watersheds? And if so, what initiatives would we take toward establishing such a system, even a pilot project, to see how that might work out in practice? A fourth strategy involves a stewardship framework for land use and conservation. Again, if you look at the history of our province, in the early days when there were no fences in Alberta, the land use policy, if you could call it that, was everyone everything, anywhere, anytime. That was Alberta's land policy. In other words, if you got ownership to a piece of land, you could virtually do whatever you wanted on it and to it. And then as our population gradually gathered in cities, that had to change. So today, you can't build an abattoir in Mount Royal, in Calgary, or in Glenora, in Edmonton, as much as you may want to, and own the land and everything else. Nor can you build a house on the runway of the Edmonton International Airport or the Calgary International Airport. In other words, we got into land use planning, including setting aside no development lands in cities called parks. Which raises the question, have we reached a point under the pressure of further population, economic growth, where the concept of land use planning, setting aside certain parts of the province for multiple or specific uses and even non-development, needs to be extended and applied to the province as a whole? I recently saw a presentation on this subject by a research group which took a draft map of the province and tried to sketch out, for discussion purposes only, priority land use zones for the various economic and conservation features of the Alberta economy and ecology. A priority zone was described as a region in Alberta where there would be an explicit recognition of the primary purpose of the region and zero tolerance of land use practices that interfered with the attainment of that primary purpose. There would, of course, be urban zones where human residency was the primary purpose, and rural zones where watershed protection or grassland protection compatible with cow-calf operations was the priority. There would be zones where hydrocarbon extraction would be the priority, where intensive crop and livestock production was the priority. There would be zones where endangered species protection would be the priority, and where parkland and recreation would be the priorities. And there would of necessity be some zones where multiple use would be permitted or encouraged. If Albertans and our future leadership get serious about such an approach to the protection of our land base, you can imagine the heated political debate that there would be around such a map. But I think we should have that debate. And we have to set up some other rules too, that if previously granted property rights would be devalued as a result of these zoning decisions, as undoubtedly some of them would, I think there would need to be a provision for compensation in accordance with the principle that private property rights should not be diminished by public policy decisions, except by due process of law and upon payment of just compensation. Politically, that's the only way I can see you getting acceptance, grudging acceptance in this province for a land use plan. If people's ox gets gored, they get compensated for the ox. But the fact that there be a huge debate over that, I don't think should prevent us from having that debate. And it needs to be led by leaders, preferably not the political leaders the first go-around. Somebody else has to float the balloon and take the flag for that kind of a concept, figure out ways to answer the objections to it, and then your political people would stick their heads out of the foxholes and say maybe it's safe to actually embrace this concept. But who is going to provide the leadership for developing a land use and stewardship policy for the province as a whole? That would be an enormous contribution to our province. And the last strategy I want to mention has to do with science, technology, and innovation policy. It's obvious that science, technology, and innovation have a huge role to play in both the development of future energy sources and in understanding the nature of ecosystems and the impact of our activities upon them. But neither the Alberta government nor the federal government has a fully developed 21st century science, technology, and innovation policy. And neither of those governments has such a policy that would explicitly try to harness science, technology, and innovation to energy conservation, to energy development, or to environmental protection. In a recent survey of Canadian corporations doing research and development, there are only 2 oil and gas companies, despite the size of some of these companies and the current profitability, there are only 2 oil and gas companies among the top 35 investors in R&D in Canada. In other words, the use of science and technology, while some companies are doing it and investing a lot more could be done in that area to harness that horse to this objective of conservation within a market economy. To my knowledge, none of our governments has issued an explicit request for proposals to the universities, the private sector, or scientific research organizations, asking them to identify what contributions they can make to the challenge of marrying environmental conservation with energy development, with the promise of funding the best and most promising of those proposals. Every politician's got a section in his speech about the science and technology and innovation is the answer, but a lot of these discussions are at 90,000 feet. They're not at the area where you people wrestle. And I guess what I'm suggesting here is another question: would you be prepared to develop and support a 21st century science, technology, innovation policy, and to urge governments to explicitly harness it to those two dual objectives, environmental conservation and market-driven economic and energy development? Now, in closing, one further thought that gets back to the political realities and possibilities. I come from a political background and always thinking about that side of things. The implementation of strategies and policies to give Alberta a sustainable future, one that is both green and one that delivers the jobs and the incomes that our people have come to expect, would be much more feasible if there was genuine bottom-up grassroots demand and support for such strategies and policies. You try and do these 5 or 6 things that I said just by people at the top, leaders, whether they're political or business leaders or university or labor leaders, just trying to float them on their own. That's a pretty hard story. There has to be some response from the bottom up. And this is where Alberta's unique political history gives us grounds for encouragement, because on at least 3 or 4 occasions in our past, grassroots Albertans have become seized with some idea that would advance the province and transform it, and have put their energy and their support into pushing that idea. Some of the biggest transformations in this province, yes, somebody had to articulate it at the top, but some of the biggest ones have been energized, not from the top, but from the bottom. In the first third of the 20th century, when the great objective in Alberta was making the transition from being this pioneer place to actually being an agricultural economy, much of the energy for achieving the necessary agricultural and transportation reforms that made that possible came from the grassroots organizational activity of the United Farmers of Alberta. The farmers' movement was a bottom-up grassroots movement. Yes, it had leadership. Yes, they put forward proposals, but the energy to make it happen came from the grassroots. In the Depression years, when Alberta was groping for radical solutions of any kind to the social and economic catastrophe of those times. This province, again, the old timers still might remember that was one time, now we're flush, but there was a time when this province was flat on its back. Well, when my father was elected to the legislature here in 1935, the budget of Alberta was $14 million. $9 million of it was debt service, so you ran the province of Alberta on $5 million. The only cash flow in those, they couldn't collect income tax, they couldn't collect, the municipalities couldn't collect property tax. The only cash flow came from sales taxes, like the fuel tax. That's where Alberta's pathological hatred of sales tax came, because that was the one tax they couldn't avoid. It got into our gene pool. You still see signs of it today. My father used to meet with Keith Huckvale, who eventually became the provincial auditor. At the end of each month, they take the cash flow that came in and prorate it to pay the civil servant. So 2/3 of what was budgeted came in, the civil servant got a paycheck, was 2/3 of what it was supposed to be. But of course, no one would quit the Depression, because at least if that job was better than no job at all. This province was flat on its back. But during that time, Albertans rallied behind the idea of monetary reform. Whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, in retrospect, we can debate about that. But there were these study groups organized all around the province that got seized. We got to do something, anything, to try to cope with this. And one of the consequences was they threw everybody out of the legislature and started over again in 1935. In the 1935 election, to get elected to the legislature of the one province, you had to promise you had to be able to make was that you've never been in the place before. This is Alberta, for better or for worse, at the bottom up. And then in the 1970s, when Economic diversification became a major provincial necessity. People conscious that we were still an agricultural province, we were becoming a petroleum province, but our cart was being pulled by two horses, both of which were driven by international markets and still very vulnerable. The whole emphasis on diversification. There was a huge upsurge of popular grassroots support, small business people very much involved in it, as well as big business people, labor people involved in that. And the idea that was eventually harnessed politically by Peter Waugh, that produced another kind of revolution in the early 1970s. I therefore want to suggest to you that the marriage of environmental conservation and market-based economic development and the implementation of policies required to achieve that objective would be greatly enhanced by the emergence of a non-partisan grassroots stewardship coalition, Alberta Stewardship Coalition, to explore and promote among the public the application of market-based solutions to our environmental challenges. And if grassroots political support is required to advance such a transformation, I could not think of a better province than the province of Alberta in which to seek that kind of support. Okay, so that's my contributions to your conference. I really look forward to, I think we're going to have a little question time. So thank you very much for having me. I hope this gives you some suggestions to chew on.
Thank you very, very much, Preston. We're able to take a few questions. Mr. Manning is prepared to answer any questions you might have on this subject, perhaps related. So we have a couple of microphones in the middle of the floor and I think towards the back. So if you come up, state your name, your affiliation, organization, and then pose the question to Mr. Manning, and he'll be pleased to answer that. Do you have any questions? We have one.
If I could hear your question just from the front here, I can repeat it so you don't have to go to those mics. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'm Tim Bancroft. I'm with the Alberta Congress Board. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Manning, for stimulating a lot of ideas here. It makes us, some of us at least, think instead of being leader of the opposition, what would have happened if you'd have been actually Prime Minister of the country. But that's probably...
I thought about that too, but...
That's possibly a wine and cheese discussion.
That's right.
But you know, you mentioned the royalty review, and of course there's been other royalty reviews in the history, and I was very interested in your historical sweep of politics in this province. Would you like to comment on this business of non-grandfathering of oil sands plants and sort of changing the rules in midstream? Is this fair pool or is this dirty pool?
Well, my short answer to that question is I think that the failure to grandfather, or put it more proactively, the willingness to break contracts made in the past just creates more uncertainty rather than certainty with respect to the royalty and tax regime. And I'm not sure, because if you, like many of you like myself, were traveling this afternoon, whether everybody's heard just what was in the royalty review, but just to quickly review the main points and then to come back to that one, Tim. As I understand, my grip is imperfect here. You're going to have Jim Carter will have a whole day to think about this and talk about that tomorrow night, so be good. But basically, I think there's a $1.4 billion boost in royalties in 2010, which is about a 20% increase. It's less than what the royalty review panel recommended, but it's quite substantial. As Tim said, there is a decision to make to do no grandfathering of existing arrangements with either Suncor or Syncrude, in essence to break those contracts and renegotiate them. They will not proceed with the oil sands severance tax, which I think is a good thing. And the government has stated its intention to become a major player with respect to in the bitumen business, which is interesting. And these changes are to be effective January 1st, 2009. Now, just analyzing those on the basis of principle, I think the principle of making royalties market sensitive, which is part of the package, is a good one. Although they focus mainly on making royalties price sensitive, they don't mention cost sensitive, which is the other side of the equation. But the principle that the government would break existing contracts, particularly with the with the current, or the two first oil sands firms, I believe, just contributes to increasing uncertainty. And how can future developers in the oil sands or anyone else be sure that the royalty regime or the tax regime that's established, that isn't going to be broken down the road? The other uncertainty that I think this whole situation creates is that the government says they're not going to implement these changes till January 1st, 2009. And there will likely be a provincial election before 2009, which means that no one can say for sure what the royalty regime will be until after January 1st, 2009. So my kind of long answer to your question is, I don't think it's a good idea to not grandfather. I think these changes create more uncertainty than they create certainty, and that's going to have eventually a negative effect on our economic development and energy growth. But you'll get lots of opinion on that from other people here over the next couple of days. Go ahead.
Good evening, Mr. Manning. My name is David Mattis. I'm here as a member of the Steering Committee and a private citizen. You've given us a lot of food for thought tonight, and I would suggest that the imperative that you give us is even bigger than a royalty regime. When you were talking, the fellows that came to mind was a book by a man by the name of Jared Diamond, and he recently wrote a book called Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. Essentially what we're addressing is some of the issues of whether or not we will have a society in the longer run. And I'm glad you touched on the issue of full market economics, as well as the issues of boundaries and such like that. I'd like to just have your comments and consideration on the issue of water, because a number of years ago, a general by the name of Richard Romer wrote a fictional book about how wars in North America would actually be fought over this particular resource. But we are faced today with the reality that we have some expertise, such as world-class people like David Shin from the U of A, the Kill Memorial Chair, being poo-pooed by people in government. We have a lot of grassroots organizations which are involved in things like this. But we are looking at a world situation where market values and economic supply to water is in absolute conflict, with the basic human right to water. Would you care to comment on it?
Well, I don't know if those two concepts are incompatible. I think there's a convergence of views both in industry and in the scientific community and the interest group community that water is a precious resource, that increasingly our activity is polluting and resulting in the deterioration of water. And that this province particularly faces the potential of water shortages, particularly in southern Alberta. And even with respect to the oil sands, so you get production up to 2 million barrels a day, and you're talking about 3 to 6 barrels of water per barrel. You're talking about a huge draw on that Athabasca river system. So I think there's a general agreement that we have to manage our water resources better and from a conservation standpoint. And I think the argument is going to be, what's the best way to do that? Now, can you do it just by increasing government regulation, setting up government water boards, government increasing layers of regulation, not just macro regulation, but micro regulation, where government tries to tell every business, every consumer to do this or don't do that? And I frankly think that that is literally administratively unfeasible. I had this, I should say argument, this discussion with Suzuki, and I said to David, like, theoretically, I guess, Alberta Environment could send out 3.5 million emails every morning to every one of us Albertans saying, watch your water consumption today, because look what you're doing, and do this or do that. But is that really feasible? But if you established a market for water with a pricing system, as I said earlier, every time one of us turns on the tap, or if somebody uses water, you get a signal that this thing is not an unlimited resource, and it is costing something, it is valuable, and this is the cost and value that we're putting on it. So I think that the debate is going to have to be, do we approach that program, that problem through basically trying to fix it through regulation, or do we fix it through markets? And of course, in reality, like so many things, it'll be a combination of the two. Nobody's saying there's no room for regulation. But the regulation, in my view, should be macro regulation that establishes that market. That governments simply cannot micro-regulate the answer to that problem. And I'd be very interested in the feedback that I've been in many discussions where this has been argued. I'd be very interested in what your views might be on whether that works.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm Hazel Kale. I am with the Department of International, Intergovernmental and Aboriginal Relations. My role is intergovernmental relations in the business and trade area. I'm going to switch from water. I'd like to talk about what I see as a strong movement for North America to pull together and become a nation in itself. It seems that we're under a lot of pressure to become conglomerated or joined or clustered together, Mexico, United States, and Canada. And I'm interested in your thoughts about how this type of clustering would affect a province like Alberta.
Well, that's a very interesting question. It's a huge question. My response to that would be twofold. On the one hand, there are these huge pressures that are forcing greater and greater economic integration. The whole question of North American energy security is not just a Canada problem or an American problem, it's a continental problem. So on the energy side, there's numerous forces pushing us in the direction of let's treat, at least from an energy security standpoint, North America as a whole. So there is integration occurring. Integration at the corporate level, integration in the policy level with the government. I think that's inevitable, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. But if Canada thinks its sovereignty is being threatened by these types of things, I think that's where the matter of political will comes in. If you want to maintain your political identity, you can. And in a way, I think Alberta illustrates that. There's no province that, at least on the energy side, that's more integrated with the United States than Alberta. But you don't hear Albertans talking about becoming the 51st state of the United States. Albertans think we can be part of that integrated thing, and we can have our own political identity. And that's a matter of political will. And I think if the political will is there, you can not only preserve but enhance your sovereignty and take the benefits of these economic trends. What is the iron law of Canadian economic development? Well, take it in the gas area. When we first built the or take the railway, when you built the CPR railway, when they first built the first railway, if you drew a circle around the Canadian Pacific when it was first proposed and figured out the costs and the benefits, the costs were more than the benefits. You couldn't justify it. As soon as you put branch lines down into the United States and drew the circle around the whole thing, now all believe in a growing economy that can provide a significant and growing wage in labor markets. I think the thing that you're getting at, and I alluded to it just briefly, that markets are, what they do best is allocate resources efficiently. They are not concerned with fairness. That's not what they do. So how they allocate may not be fair. And that's where public policy and governments, I believe, have to intervene. And that may very well be the case in the educational field and the labor markets as well. I think particularly in this province, if we want to evolve from a resource economy to a knowledge economy, the investments that have to be made in education and training are huge to make that transition. My own view is that we should be taking a very large portion of these savings, this extra 1.4 billion or whatever it is that we're going to get out of the royalty review, and investing that on the education and training side. So that's a public action to try to address the problem that you're talking about. But I think in this type of discussion, we're best to separate these two questions. What's the most efficient way of allocating a resource, including labor? And in my view, a market's the best way to do it. And so you do that. And then you look at, does that create some unfairness or inequity? There's lags, there's insufficient investment in that because there hasn't been sufficient investment in the past. Then make a government decision to reduce the inequity. But just because a market creates an inequity, don't not think of using a market solution. Okay, there's one for you to chew on. I could elaborate on that just a little bit more, but when I talk on this water stuff, I've given speeches to the irrigation guys in the south. Now, as long as you're talking 90,000 feet, okay, talking to these irrigation people, I'm saying I think we should price and measure every drop of water that's used in this province, including the water that you guys use and waste a lot of, but use or should choose. And these are all kind of private enterprise farm guys, market-oriented guys, as long as you're talking 90,000 feet. They say, yeah, that's right, you know, markets, we like believe in markets, etc. Of course, after a while, the wheels are starting to turn. Wait a minute, if we do what this guy's saying, wouldn't that increase our input costs and we can't pass it on because we're working international markets? So the market is one way of allocating, but it creates a fairness problem. They say, well, this is unfair, and we're going to carry the burden, we can't pass it on. So I say to them, well, when this province was electrifying, remember when this province was electrifying? Originally, it was a lot easier to electrify southern Alberta than it was northern Alberta because of the way the market was. There was more population there, it was easier to build power lines, etc., etc. But we didn't not electrify because there was an equity problem. We went ahead and electrified, and then we tried to fix the equity problem. We ended up using cross-subsidization. The South cross-subsidized the power rates in the North for years and still doing it to some extent. So I suggest on any of these applications of market mechanisms, they will be pointing in the direction of the efficient solution. It will create an equity problem, separate that, and then see what does the government have to do to address it. That's my best cut at how to handle that very difficult question. Okay, I think we've exhausted everybody, Mr. Chairman. So thank you once again for this opportunity. I do want to, I think you're dead on, and some genius scheduled your conference for the day after this announcement. So I do wish you all the very best in the next couple of days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you again, Mr. Manning. I would want to call you back up, though, because we really appreciate your comments on the perspectives of Alberta and the green economy, and I'm sure the ideas that were shared will help our deliberations in the next few days. So on behalf of Alberta Congress Board, I'd like to present this to a proud Albertan, a visionary, and an outstanding Canadian. We've been blessed by Mr. Manning's comments. We're now going to move to a different part of our program, and before we break into wine and the cheese reception that's going to follow outside in the Great Hall, just a few reminders for you. First, be sure that you've picked up your registration package at the conference desk. Kimberly Sears, Susan MacArthur are there to assist you with this or anything else related to conference activities. Please remember you must have your name tags on and have your tickets in order to get into the various functions like tonight, especially for meals and receptions. So please be sure to do this right away. And you might notice that the color of your badges are white for delegates and companions, yellow for speakers and panelists, blue for conference staff. Also, as part of your registration to this conference, you're automatically a member of the Alberta Congress Board, so congratulations. Basically, by registering and attending the conference, we consider you a member of the organization. And there's information about the Alberta Congress Board in your program booklet, outlining our mission statement and how our organization works. Second, and on the same note, I would encourage you to review the conference program and the activities that are also part of that program booklet. Please note, for example, breakfast is 7:45 tomorrow morning in this room, the Beauvais room. At this time, I welcome everybody to join us in the Great Hall, just outside these doors for wine and cheese. This is sponsored by the Alberta Building Trades Council. And Jerry Donnelly, I know you're in the room, would you please stand up? Let's acknowledge Jerry and the Alberta Building Trades Council for their generous contribution. Well, while you're in the Great Hall, please feel free to look at the displays and please enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.